Do our colonies pay? I have before me a copy of Socialist Commentary, the organ of the Socialist Vanguard Group, and another of Bulletin, the organ of the American Council on Jewish-Arab Cooperation. From the first, I take the following sentences. The balance sheet between Britain and India gives little support to the hypothesis that Britain is exploiting India. A merely moral approach to colonial problems is insufficient so long as many persons are hoodwinked into believing that the British economy is largely dependent upon the possession of India and other colonies. From the second, I take the following. British governments pledged to maintain the empire have shown and can show no deviation in foreign policy regardless of political denomination. The British standard of living depends on the empire, and the empire must have permanent military installations in the Far East. Here, therefore, you have one writer in a left-wing paper flatly stating that British living standards are dependent on colonial expansion, and another writer in another left-wing paper stating equally definitely that they are not so dependent. For the moment, I am not concerned with the question of which of them is right, but with the fact that they can differ in this way. It is probably not important that one paper is British and the other American, since the writer in the British paper is an American, as it happens. It should be noticed that the question of whether we are exploiting India and the question of whether our prosperity depends on India are separate. It may well be that we are exploiting India, but for the profit of a small minority, without benefit to the nation as a whole. And of these two questions, the second is the more immediately important. If it is really true that our comparative comfort is simply a product of imperialism, that such things as the beverage scheme, increased old age pensions, raising of the school leaving age, slum clearance, improved health services, and whatnot are luxuries which we can only afford if we have millions of Oriental slaves at our command, that, surely, is a serious consideration. For, as socialists, we want an improved standard of living for our own people, and, again, as socialists, we want justice for the colonial peoples. Are the two things compatible? Whatever the rights and wrongs of the matter may be, one would at least think that this question could be authoritatively answered. The facts, which are chiefly statistical facts, must be ascertainable. Yet no agreed opinion exists. These two flatly contradictory statements, which I quoted above, are typical of hundreds of others which I could collect. I know people who can prove to me with pencil and paper that we should be just as well off, or perhaps better, if all our colonial possessions were lost to us. And I know others who can prove that if we had no colonies to exploit, our standard of living would slump catastrophically. And, curiously enough, this division of opinion cuts right across political parties. Thus, all Tories are imperialists, but whereas some Tories assert that without our empire we should be ruined economically as well as militarily, others assert that the empire is a non-paying concern and that we only maintain it from motives of public spirit. Socialists of the extreme left, such as the ILP, usually take it for granted that Britain would be plunged into the blackest poverty if she stopped looting the coloured peoples, while others, not far to the right of them, declare that if only the coloured peoples were liberated, they would develop more rapidly and their productive power would increase, which would be to our own advantage. Among Asiatic nationalists, the same old division of opinion exists. The most violently anti-British ones declare that when India is lost, the British will all starve to death, while others argue that a free and friendly India would be a much better customer for British goods than a hostile and backward dependency. And yet, as I said above, this is quite obviously not an insoluble question. The figures that would settle it once and for all must exist, if one knew where to look for them. However, it is not necessarily the case that either of the two current options is the right one. The person who says, "Yes, Britain depends on India," usually assumes that if India were free, British trade with India would cease forthwith. The person who says, "No, Britain doesn't depend on India," usually assumes that if India were free, British-Indian trade would proceed as before, with no period of dislocation. My own view has always been, A, that over a long period we have definitely exploited, i.e., robbed our colonial possessions. B, that to some extent the whole British nation has benefited from this in an economic sense. And C, that we cannot make restitution to the colonial peoples without lowering our own standard of living for several years at the least. The really essential thing, almost never mentioned when this subject is raised, is the time factor. Quite likely it would be to our advantage to make an end of imperialism, but not immediately. There might be a long and uncomfortable transition period first. This is a bleak thought, and I believe that it is a half-conscious avoidance of it that makes almost all discussions of this question curiously unreal. At the general election, for instance, the avoidance of imperial issues was quite astonishing. When foreign affairs were mentioned at all, the reference was almost invariably to the USSR or the United States. I don't think I ever heard any speaker on any platform mention India spontaneously. Once or twice, at Labour meetings, I tried the experiment of asking a question about India to get an answer which sounded something like this. The Labour Party is, of course, in fullest sympathy with the aspiration of the Indian people towards independence. Next question, please. And there the matter dropped, with not a flicker of interest on the part of the audience. The handbook issued to Labour speakers contained 200 pages, out of which one not very informative page was devoted to India. Yet, India has nearly 10 times the population of Britain. The subjects which, in my experience, roused real passion were housing, full employment, and social insurance. Who could have guessed, from the manner in which they were discussed, that these subjects were in any way bound up with our possession of colonies which give us raw materials and assured markets? In the long run, an evasion of the truth is always paid for. One thing that we are gradually paying for now is our failure to make clear to the British people that their prosperity depends partly on factors outside Britain. Extremists of both right and left have grossly exaggerated the advantages of imperialism, while the optimists who stand between them have talked as though military control over your markets and sources of raw material were of no importance. They have assumed that a liberated India would still be our customer, without considering what might happen if India passed under control of a foreign power, or broke up into anarchy, or developed a closed economy, or were ruled over by a nationalist government which made a policy of boycotting British goods. What we ought to have said throughout these last 20 years is something like this. It is our duty as socialists to liberate the subject peoples, and in the long run it will be to our advantage as well. But only in the long run. In the short run, we have got to count with the hostility of these people, with the chaos into which they will probably fall, and with their frightful poverty, which will compel us to give them goods of various kinds in order to put them on their feet. If we are very lucky, our standard of living may not suffer by the liberation of the colonies, but the probability is that it will suffer for years, or even for decades. You have got to choose between liberating India and having extra sugar. Which do you prefer? What would the average woman in the fish queue say if it were put to her like that? I am not certain. But the point is that it never has been put to her like that, and if she plumps for the extra sugar, as she may, when the moment of crisis comes, it will be because the issues have not been fully discussed beforehand. Instead, we have had such contradictory statements as I quoted above, both in the last analysis untrue, and both, in their different ways, tending to perpetuate imperialism.